This is the story of a halted armoured convoy, the crossed pikes of the yeoman warders at the heavy gates of the Tower of London. And the exact moment Queen Camilla realised she does not own a single diamond on her head, in less than 24 hours, the carefully constructed illusion of her absolute command over the dynasty is priceless. Physical heritage was quietly and ruthlessly dismantled by a sealed legal document. What Queen Camilla just realised behind closed doors is that a title might grant you the privilege of wearing the sovereign's historic jewels for the cameras. But true institutional hard power is forged in strict heritage law, unbroken bloodlines, and the silent, impenetrable control of the Royal Collection Trust. Over the next few minutes, we are going to unpack the highly opportunistic, culturally aggressive power grab she recently attempted under the guise of an international art exhibition. We will expose how a clandestine maneuver to permanently extract the monarchy's most iconic jewels into the hands of her non-royal family inadvertently triggered a freezing institutional retaliation engineered by Princess Anne and Prince William. By the end of this breakdown, you will understand the devastating realization currently paralyzing the Queen, that despite sitting on the highest throne in the land, her aesthetic empire is nothing more than a temporary, heavily monitored loan. To fully grasp the magnitude of this internal cultural warfare, we must first step back and analyze the monumental 30-year psychologicals, manipulation that brought Camilla to this modern peak of social supremacy. For 3 decades, she executed the longest, most forensic game of reputational rehabilitation in British history. She survived the bitter public ruin of the 1990s, systematically softened the global memory of the late Princess of Wales, and patiently replaced legacy palace officials with her own dedicated loyalists. But of all the battlegrounds in Camilla's long war for legitimacy, none was more symbolically vital than the sovereign vault. For years, she engaged in a silent visual warfare, meticulously selecting and wearing the iconic tiaras, emeralds and sapphires intrinsically linked to Queen Elizabeth II and Princess Diana. For Camilla, donning these priceless historical artifacts was the undeniable forensic evidence of her total victory. When she was officially crowned queen, discarding the restrictive consort caveat entirely, she believed she had achieved an absolute unshakable mandate over the royal vault. She operated under the fundamental belief that her psychological control over King Charles was synonymous with absolute ownership over the sprawling, glittering archives of the crown. She felt entirely untouchable, assuming that the palace curators, the master jewelers, and the heavily guarded archivists would always bend to her personal aesthetic agenda. But the fatal flaw in Camilla's complex architecture of power is a fundamental, almost arrogant misunderstanding of royal heritage law. She conflated the temporary privilege of custody with the absolute right of permanent ownership, completely isolating herself from the enduring structural control held by the true guardians of the bloodline. That dangerous illusion of absolute authority collided with a brutal reality just days ago, driven by an overwhelming sense of commercial and historical desperation. To understand the weapon she tried to wield, you must understand the Royal Collection Trust. It is not the King's personal jewelry box. It is a legally distinct, fiercely protected charitable trust that holds the sovereign's art, diamonds and historical artifacts in custody for the nation and the successors to the throne. As the realities of King Charles's fragile reign become impossible to ignore, a deep-seated paranoia has taken root within Camilla's private office. Fearing that her access to the sovereign vault will instantly evaporate the moment the crown shifts to the next generation, plunging her back into visual obscurity, her senior advisors attempted an unprecedented administrative heist. Behind the scenes, during a quiet transition period in the palace curatorial staff, Camilla's logistical team quietly drafted a sweeping heritage mandate. What appears to be true, according to internal archive leaks, is that her office attempted to secretly execute a highly sophisticated transfer of assets. Under the carefully sanitized guise of public education and democratizing the royal archives, Camilla ordered the drafting of a permanent, indefinite loan agreement for a massive cache of the monarchy's most recognizable, historically significant jewelry. This targeted list did not just include minor brooches, it included iconic tiaras, historic diamond collars, and centuries-old artifacts. The most staggering detail of this clandestine operation was the destination of these priceless assets. Camilla was not sending them to a national museum. She directed the indefinite loan to a newly established private arts foundation managed directly by her non-royal daughter, Laura Lopes, and a curated board of Parker Bowles loyalists. It was a calculated aggressive attempt to legally launder the physical heritage of the House of Windsor out of the sovereign vaults and into the permanent commercial and historical control of her own family. She wanted to use the immense glittering prestige of the crown to build an untouchable aesthetic empire. For her lineage before the political winds of the monarchy could shift, she assumed she could quietly push these transfer deeds through the curatorial bureaucracy, firmly believing that no archivist would dare question the logistical demands of the king's wife. She severely underestimated the cold forensic vigilance of Princess Anne and the uncompromising protection of Prince William. The discovery of this secret cultural coup did not manifest through an explosive family confrontation in the drawing rooms of Buckingham Palace. You do not attempt to siphon off the raw physical history of the sovereign bloodline without triggering alarms, especially when the ultimate overseers of the Royal Collection Trust include the Princess Royal. Princess Anne possesses the fierce, unyielding institutional memory of the crown, and she watches over the family's legacy with terrifying forensic vigilance. The anomaly in the archival request forms was flagged during a routine digital review of the trust's ledger and vault extraction manifest by senior curators. When the paperwork detailing the permanent loan of priceless sovereign assets to a Parker Bowles Foundation reached Princess Anne, she recognized it instantly as a parasitic encroachment upon the sovereign truth of the bloodline. She did not confront Camilla in a chaotic, undignified argument. She took the paper trail directly to the one man who holds the absolute administrative authority to stop it, Prince William, the future king, and the ultimate guardian of the inheritance. When William and Anne reviewed the transfer deeds together, the realization was immediate and chilling. Camilla was attempting to weaponize her temporary reign to literally steal the unvarnished physical history of the monarchy, while Catherine, the Princess of Wales, continues her uncomplaining sacrifice, strictly adhering to curatorial guidelines and steadfastly protecting the institution's public dignity. Camilla was utilizing the bureaucratic system to strip the dynasty of its most sacred artifacts for private family gain. For William, this crossed an invisible, unforgivable legal line. It was a direct, psychological and commercial attack on the legacy of the women who came before her. Attempting to treat the royal collection as a liquidation sale for her non-royal relatives, the response from the future king and the Princess Royal was executed with a freezing, ruthless legality that used the very weight of institutional protocol as a weapon. Prince William did not leak the attempted heist to the press, nor did he allow his officers to engage in an angry public statement that would distress his family. He utilized the system to execute a silent, devastating counterstrike, operating with unprecedented administrative leverage as the heir apparent. William quietly coordinated a strict binding protocol update with the Board of Trustees for the Royal Collection. Internally, this maneuver is now quietly referred to as the Sovereign Heritage Asset Freeze. Without a single word spoken in anger, William and Anne legally and entirely overhauled the vault extraction process. They activated a rigid, unyielding protocol, dictating that absolutely no sovereign assets, jewelry, or historical artifacts could be transferred, loaned, or removed from the secure premises without the explicit physical co-signature of both the Prince of Wales and the Princess Royal. They effectively stripped Camilla's office of all independent administrative oversight regarding the royal collection, turning the jewel house into an impenetrable fortress governed entirely by the true bloodline. The execution of this silent retaliation was breathtaking in its subtlety, resulting in an absolute visual and psychological humiliation for the Queen. Camilla did not receive an angry confrontation before the extraction date. Instead, the trap was set to spring at the exact moment she could do absolutely nothing about it. On the morning, the sprawling cache of historic jewels was scheduled to be discreetly moved out of the royal vaults to the private foundation. Camilla's heavily guarded private armoured transport convoy arrived at the ancient gates of the Tower of London. Her hand-picked art handlers and private security personnel expected to walk directly into the jewel house, utilizing their sovereign clearance to collect the ultimate physical evidence of her supremacy. They did not find a welcoming committee of subservient curators ready to hand over the diamonds. Instead, as the armoured vans approached the secure perimeter of the fortress, they hit an invisible, impenetrable wall of state protocol. The heavy iron gates did not open. The heavily armed yeoman warders, operating under direct binding orders from the Royal Collection Trust and Prince William's administrative office, politely but firmly halted the Queen's extraction team. In a display of freezing aristocratic restraint, the guards crossed their pikes, physically blocking the entrance to the vault. The The officers informed Camilla's handlers that their vault clearance and asset extraction manifests had been flagged, frozen, and permanently revoked under the new Heritage Asset Guidelines. They were denied entry. Their digital credentials had been completely wiped from the archival mainframe. Furthermore, the lead handler was handed a perfectly polite, heavily formalized legal document from William's estate, clearly stating that the requested assets belong entirely to the Sovereign Trust, and any unauthorized attempts to permanently rehouse them would be treated as a violation of the Crown's heritage laws. The armored convoy was forced to turn around and leave the ancient fortress entirely empty-handed. What looked like a routine security check was actually a total dismantling of Camilla's aesthetic empire. As the reality of the halted convoy and the locked vault was relayed back to her private quarters at Buckingham Palace, Camilla experienced a wave of cold, suffocating panic. She realized that her administrative trick had not only failed, but it had permanently exposed her terrifying vulnerability. Stripped of her illusion of supreme control, walled off by her stepson and sister-in-law, and publicly disciplined without a single word being spoken, she knew the trap had snapped shut. She was forced to confront the commercial and historical reality that the diamonds she wore on her head, the necklaces that defined her royal image, belonged entirely to the man whose mother she had replaced. Terrified by the sudden collapse of her authority over the royal vault, Camilla retreated to the one remaining card she had left to play. She gathered the humiliating asset freeze documents, bypassed her staff, and went directly to King Charles's study. She demanded that he use his supreme sovereign power to crush William and Anne's administrative blockade, force the tower to open its gates, and aggressively enforce her absolute ownership over the royal heritage. The entire future of the internal royal hierarchy hung in the heavy, suffocating silence of the king's study, as the queen stood waiting for her husband to deliver her salvation. The heavy, tapestried doors of the king's study closed, sealing Queen Camilla inside with the suffocating realization of her own vulnerability. She laid the humiliating asset freeze documents on the king's desk, the forensic proof that her private armored convoy had been turned away from the Tower of London by her stepson and sister-in-law. For 30 years, Charles had been her ultimate shield. He had fought his mother, his advisors, the British press, and his own children to force Camilla's acceptance into the royal fold. She fully expected that in this moment of acute cultural humiliation, Charles would summon Prince William and Princess Anne, activate his supreme sovereign authority, and deliver a crushing reprimand. She expected the king to remind his heirs that Camilla was the crowned queen, and that her aesthetic demands must be met to preserve the visual unity of her reign. But she encountered something far more terrifying than sovereign rage. She encountered a devastating, absolute silence. What appears to be true, according to those familiar with the internal dynamics of the king's household, is that Charles simply refused to intervene. He did not raise his voice. He did not defend his wife's aggressive attempt to permanently extract the monarchy's priceless jewels for her private family foundation. He looked at the flagged extraction manifests. He read the legally binding sovereign heritage asset freeze issued jointly by his son and his sister. He sat in the suffocating quiet of his study, and he did absolutely nothing. This was the psychological climax of Camilla's decades-long campaign for total institutional supremacy, and it ended with a freezing realization. Charles is no longer the rebel Prince of Wales fighting for his mistreated lover. He is the sovereign. And as the monarch facing his own profound vulnerabilities, health battles, and the fragile transitional state of his reign, his primary overriding duty is the preservation of the crown's historical and structural integrity. Charles knows with forensic clarity that the Royal Collection Trust is not his personal property. It is the absolute, visible manifestation of the monarchy's enduring mystique, heavily monitored by the government and historical preservationists. To attempt to use his emotional weight to override a strict heritage blockade, simply to appease his wife's vanity and provide a permanent aesthetic empire for her non-royal daughter, would be an act of institutional suicide. To dismantle William and Anne's invocation of the asset freeze would signal a chaotic, degraded monarchy that allows the king's wife to cannibalize the sacred physical history of the state. In that singular moment of silence, Charles chose the unvarnished survival of the institution over the aesthetic ambition of his wife. Camilla learned the hardest lesson of her royal life: the king will no longer save her from the guardians of the bloodline. This silent betrayal exposed the terrifying architecture of Camilla's reality. forcing her to confront a landscape of pure commercial and historical desperation. To the global public, she is a queen draped in historic diamonds, wearing the legendary tiaras of the realm, and projecting the image of a supreme matriarch whose victory is absolute. They assume that because she wears the crown today, she owns the vault of tomorrow. But behind closed doors, the forensic architecture of the firm tells a remarkably different story. Camilla owns virtually nothing of the royal future, and her hand-picked arts foundation possesses absolutely no legal standing to inherit the crown's history. The priceless emeralds, the sovereign collars, and the centuries-old tiaras belong entirely and exclusively to the trust, guarded by the next generation. If the reign of King Charles were to unexpectedly end, Camilla would instantly transform into a dowager queen, stripped of the sovereign jewels and completely dependent on her stepson's curatorial goodwill for any future aesthetic relevance. Her frantic attempt to rewrite the loan agreements of the Jewel House was never just about wanting to set up a nice museum exhibition for her daughter. It was a frantic, calculated maneuver to secure a permanent visual foothold in the global aristocracy before her ultimate protector is gone. She knows that without King Charles, she instantly loses access to the very artifacts that legitimized her reign. Prince William and Princess Anne are not just family members. They are the ultimate gatekeepers of the dynasty's exclusivity. By instituting the co-signature requirement on all vault extractions, they legally, quietly and permanently locked her shadow court out of the Jewel House, reminding her that her power is entirely theoretical, while theirs is deeply legally structural. The realization that her entire visual empire is now effectively boxed in by her stepson's administrative goodwill is a psychological prison of her own making. The illusion of absolute aesthetic control was instantly replaced by the stark, terrifying reality of her irrelevance to the future. As Camilla's shadow empire was quietly dismantled at the gates of the Tower of London, the visual landscape of the monarchy began to immediately reflect the new order. This is where the silent execution of revenge translates into undeniable public reality. In the days following this internal crisis, viewers and royal analysts noticed a profound, subtle shift in how the royal heritage is being weaponized. The Princess of Wales emerged as a portrait of freezing, aristocratic restraint without ever having to issue a single public statement defending the royal vault. Catherine did not need to negotiate for respect, demand access to specific tiaras, or complain about who gets to wear the historic diamonds. She simply allowed the massive quiet weight of her husband's absolute authority to protect the institution. During a highly publicized state banquet shortly after the convoy was halted, the visual shifts were devastating to anyone who knows how to read the subtle language of the palace. Camilla attended the event wearing a modest, previously unseen piece of jewelry from her private collection, visibly lacking the towering historical artifacts she typically commanded. But when Catherine, the Princess of Wales, entered the glittering ballroom, she was wearing the exact iconic diamond and pearl tiara that Camilla had attempted to secretly transfer to her daughter's foundation. Catherine wore it flawlessly, projecting an aura of absolute unshakable permanence. She conversed with international dignitaries, effortlessly commanding the space, the diamonds reflecting the undeniable truth of the bloodline. This was not a petty public relations choice. In the highest echelons of the British royal family, the utilization of sovereign assets is the forensic evidence of shifting power. By flawlessly wearing the targeted heritage piece, authorized seamlessly through her husband and the Princess Royal's secure channels, Catherine was actively executing the institutional restoration of the true bloodline while signaling the permanent boundary placed upon Camilla. She demonstrated that uncomplaining sacrifice, fierce protection of the nation's history, and steadfast loyalty to the crown will always outmaneuver the unchecked ambition of outsiders. She does not need to fight Camilla for dominance because her husband has already engineered the ultimate checkmate. The true royals remain on the inside, protecting the physical integrity of the state, and the opportunistic liabilities are managed with halted armored convoys and locked iron gates. This brings us to the deeper tragic meaning of this entire crisis. Camilla spent 30 years carefully clawing her way to the very top of the British social hierarchy. She endured intense public hatred, she orchestrated a masterful public relations rehabilitation, and she successfully convinced Charles to place the highest crown in the land upon her head. She believed that reaching the summit meant she would finally be safe, that she could secure her family's place in the global aristocracy and physically extract the history of the monarchy to build her own legacy. But what this story of the Tower of London lockout undeniably proves is that the crown on Camilla's head cannot override the heritage laws of the state. She is surrounded by the trappings of unimaginable wealth. Yet she is paralyzed by the operational reality that she is merely a temporary custodian in William's empire. She played a 30-year game of chess, sacrificing everything for the ultimate title, only to realize too late that the Prince of Wales and the Princess Royal hold the keys to the vault. Camilla is now trapped in a gilded cage of her own making, sitting next to a king who will no longer defend her cultural overreach, walled off from the true assets of the monarchy and forced to live under the absolute unyielding curatorial authority of the next generation. The era of the Shadow Queen attempting to restructure the physical history of the state is effectively over. If you want to continue unpacking the silent warfare, the hidden administrative maneuvers, and the psychological power dynamics of the modern British monarchy, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We will continue to pull back the curtain on the illusions of power, one subtle detail at a time. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next analysis.